is there room in our cities for poor people? Last time I was here chairing Politics in the Pub, we were talking about homelessness, and I think I prefaced the introduction of our speakers with a polite but courageous expression of utter outrage that in Australia tonight there is just shy of 120,000 people who have nowhere to sleep. They are the poorest of the poor. They can't afford cheap housing, they can't afford social housing, they can't afford anything. And as a card-carrying member of a leading political party, which disgraces me in itself, that particular party, like other parties in Australia that purport to be able to lead government in Australia and in New South Wales, have been manifestly incompetent when it comes to fixing the problem. It's not a big problem when you are as affluent and as wealthy as this nation. The fact that there's one person sleeping rough tonight would be a national disgrace. The fact that there's 120,000 of them is a complete and utter disgrace. And the solution's very simple. And we're very fortunate tonight to have two speakers who can share with us some of those solutions. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Peter Phibbs and Mary Perkins. Professor Peter Phibbs is an urban planner with an international reputation in the area of housing studies. He's had a lot of very, very interesting jobs, including being Associate Dean, Academic Staff in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Sydney. His research over many years has included the non-shelter outcomes of housing, the broad area of affordable housing. He's supervised in excess of 14 PhD completions and more than 5 Masters by research. That means that he's written many books over and above the ones that he's authored himself. Peter himself holds a PhD in Regional Economics from the University of New South Wales, and he could probably tell interesting stories about the transition between Uni of New South Wales and Sydney. In addition to appointments at various universities, he's chair of the Urban and Regional Planning faculty and the director of the Henry Halloran Trust at the University of Sydney. He's widely published, as well as being a leading light in all of the work that's done in the context of shelter. Wonderful to have you both here. Please join me in welcoming Mary and Peter. And Mary will speak to you.
Thanks very much for the invite, and yeah, I also remind people that we're having this meeting on Aboriginal land. Thanks very much, Mary, and I can really commend this brochure, which I had a bit of a chance to scan earlier this evening. It's got a lot of detail about some of the ideas I'm going to quickly sketch through. Let me tell you a little bit about my housing history. Actually, my first ever house out of my folks' home was on the corner of Wigram Road, and just out of the corner here. This was our local pub. I could actually sort of spit from my bedroom onto the, well, I probably didn't, you know, but the front bar of this hotel. And you can sort of do that. That was, trust me, a long time ago. That was, I'm 59 now, that was when I was 21, so that was a long time ago. But students could actually afford to live in Glebe. I noticed the other day that house, actually it was a terrace house on the corner, sold for $2 million. Now, you just think, oh my God, what's happened in all that time? It's gone from student housing really to, you know, really very upmarket housing. Look at the old Harold Park, you know, raceway. We actually had a real bit of a disaster when I was living there. We had to pay the rent. We didn't quite have enough money. We went down to the Trots to try and actually get the rent. And I had one of my friends, you know, came around, was an expert on all matters equine. We actually lost the lot. So, very tricky conversation with the landlord that week. But look at what's gone on down there. I mean, holy hell, it looks like you wouldn't get much change out of $2 million for a lot of apartments in the Harold Park Raceway. Now, there is some affordable housing on there, that the City of Sydney has organised, but it's a very small proportion of what's going down. And that is one of those terrible, I mean, I think the Harness Racing Authority bought it for $1. And trust me, they sold it for more than $1. Exactly Mary's point. There's plenty of money swishing around in the housing system. You know, people just can't believe how much money there is in the Sydney housing system. But in terms of working in a way that will help people across the housing spectrum and the income spectrum, we've got a long way to go. So one of the things I'm going to actually give you a little insight into is a theorist. Now, it's a funny thing to talk about theorists and politics in the pub. And I wasn't incredibly good at housing theory when I was a student. But there was one housing theory that actually stuck in my head. And I'll share it with you tonight. And that is a guy called David Harvey, who is still alive, for the students in the audience, who actually described the housing market like going to the movies. But what actually happened was the less money you had, the later you got there. So if you're a low-income person, all you really could get was the front row of the cinema. You know, so the housing market really is working as a way of sifting poor people's opportunity in cities. But I think what's happened for a lot of people, they can't even get in the front row anymore. So when we look at where people go when they move out of Sydney, a lot of people have moved to the Central Coast, the Illawarra, sometimes out west, looking for cheaper housing. The housing market is really what's driving them out of the movie theatre. We'll come back to that. Now, that's bad enough when the market's doing it. When the market is actually, you know, basically just people are making the decision they'd rather live up at Gosford and, you know, commute for the times they have to come to the city than live here. But when the government starts doing it, seriously, it's time to worry. And I would shout out, as the cruelest piece of public policy I've seen in my entire lifetime is the crap that's going on down at Millers Point at the moment. Where, seriously, I've got to know a lot of the people down there. They're just trying to live their life out in peace. And because some brainiac thinks that we can make all this money by selling expensive properties, we're actually torching, and I suspect we're probably accelerating the death of a lot of the people in that community. And that, seriously, it's bad enough when people, you know, basically are doing it for greed. When your government is doing it, seriously, I think what do they say? Enough is enough, Mary. I think enough is enough. It really is appalling. And I'd urge you to try and get involved in that campaign. The thing that worries me about Millers Point is I think it's just a start. I'd be really surprised we didn't have lots of circles on houses in Glebe and Woolloomooloo, because the governments, you know, really think they're economic geniuses because they work out they can sell public housing, and that really worries me. The thing about the Millers Point thing that I find really most galling is there is a way that they could still make some money from the sales by just letting people live their life out in those dwellings. And, you know, when some of them aren't incredibly suitable for older people because of the steep stairs, thinking about maybe transferring them into Sirius was an obvious strategy. But what they did was they've relocated a lot of people, and seriously, anyone with, you know, older, or just think of telling someone, you know, that's lived in one place for 25 years, they've actually got to move, and you're not exactly sure where, and you've got to go on a lottery to find out where you go. It's really, I just think it's a really shameful act of public policy. The other thing I just, you know, like to talk about, I think, is the notion of the global city. And Sydney, whether we like it or not, is now a global city. So a lot of people with a lot of money unfortunately want to live here. And I think what's happened is in that race to the top, we've actually seen prices really go crazy. What housing has become in Sydney, like lots of other global cities, is just basically a speculation form. So at the moment, the largest number of people in the market are people in Sydney who are experiencing what they call, there's a name for it in the literature, called FOMO, which stands for fear of missing out. I'm a speculator. I want to buy some more housing in Sydney just in case the price keeps going up, because I'm trying to make a mozza. So now when you look at the actual statistics for who's actually in getting finance for housing, not most of the market, but certainly a majority of the market are now investors. And, you know, we turn basically housing into a commodity good, you know, in a form of speculation. rather than a sense of shelter, which is where it started. I thought I'd just talk about a few solutions, and I really would commend, Mary's booklet. Well, not Mary's booklet, but Shelter's booklet. I think really addresses the issue. But it's not like there isn't some solutions if there was some actual political will to do it. And one of the things I think that, having worked in the housing area for a long time, I actually think the default position of almost all politicians in this space around housing costs is to look concerned. They're really good at looking concerned. They look you straight in the eye and they say, Peter, affordable housing is the government's #1 priority. And you sort of think, well, Minister, that's a great thing, but maybe you should do something. You're the Minister, I'm an academic. Maybe you could, those regulations, make a oh, Peter, look, I'm talking to Cabinet about that. I'm going to get back to you shortly. Now, I just can't believe that we actually haven't got, there's solutions all around the world. There's more solutions in that booklet. If we actually implemented half of those, we actually could redress some of the things that Mary and I have been talking about. But because so many people are winners out of the housing market, 2/3 of people in Australia are homeowners, government's nervous about making that lobby upset. The other big lobby we've got to fight with are the property lobby, the property council, the development industry, who seriously, developers in Sydney are shoveling money into, they almost can't count it. We're in the middle of the biggest boom a lot of developers have ever seen. They're shoveling money, into whatever they drive around these days. I don't keep up with developers' cars, but into their boot. We could actually look at a mechanism to share some of that. So let me give an example. One of the things I teach is planning. Look at a suburb like Parramatta. Parramatta, used to be zoned for 4 or 6-story apartments. It's now being rezoned for 20, sometimes 50-story apartment blocks. Now, if a developer buys a block of land and gets it rezoned through the public planning system, essentially what they're getting in that process, say it goes from 6 stories to 10 stories, they're essentially getting 4 stories of housing without paying for the land. A housing block in Parramatta, a housing component of an apartment block is probably $100,000. We're giving a developer $100,000 for maybe 30 or 40 apartments, for nothing. Now, I would advocate that, what we should be doing is sharing that uplift with the public. So we could put it into affordable housing, we could put it into creating some decent public amenities in some of those places, but essentially we're just not taking a position that's sharing that uplift. There is a lot of money in the Sydney housing market compared to lots of other housing markets, so it's not like we've got to look hard for solutions, but oh my God, that would be terrible because the developers might take their money and go somewhere else. I mean, who's going to take their money and go somewhere else when they're getting that much value, particularly in today's market? So I think that's one really obvious thing we could do. New York, for God's sake, I'm going there next week trying to get over a really significant birthday. Don't you just guess what it is later. And New York's mayor, God love him, has got an affordable housing policy to create 200,000 affordable housing dwellings over a 10-year period. What have we got in New South Wales? The Liberal Party's got a press release saying, they're going to start a fund, which is, always worries me when politicians say up to $1 billion. There's a lot of ifs and buts. There's some memorandum of understanding signed with the various parties, but no details. No details. The Labor Party has promised $100 million worth of money for community housing providers, interest-free, which is something. So I'd encourage you to look at both parties' housing policies. But compared to some of the things they can do that are described in this booklet, they're not really thinking about too much happening. I've got a few suggestions around political lobbying. I actually think there is an opportunity to try and make a change. Essentially, the problem's been there's been so many winners, people have been scared to take it on. There's actually a lot of losers in the housing market in Sydney, and one of the big losers are youth. Now let me describe an experience I had 2 weeks ago in a lecture where I was teaching my planning students, 60 people in a classroom. We're talking about the Sydney housing market. I showed them the latest graph of Sydney house prices that sort of looks almost like a vertical line. So they reckon this year prices in Sydney are going to go up 20%. Now, if you own a house, you think you're a financial genius. If you're a person like this guy was, 35, you're trying to save for a deposit, you're absolutely flabbergasted because your savings can't keep up with the house price. If you're trying to find a 5 or 10% deposit, that for a lot of young people is the drama. So this guy puts his hand up when I show the graph and he says, Professor, he says, what are you going to do about it? And then he didn't even say that. He actually said, what are you, blip, 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 going to do about it? And, you know, and I thought, oh my God, that's pretty aggro, you know, because usually students don't get that aggro at you because you've got to mark their assignments. They realise that, you know what I mean? There's a sort of power relationship I won't go into. It's probably another politics in the pub. But, you know, young people are incredibly angry about the fact that lots of people, including myself, you know, are in the housing market and we're capturing all these capital gains and their housing trajectory just looks terrible. Like, my advice to my students is their #1 housing policy is for them should be to feed their parents hot chips and tell them not to have any exercise. Because that is really, for a lot of them, their only option. So be careful out there if you've got kids that, you know, come up with hot chips and tell you should lay in the couch longer because it's probably them trying to get their inheritance earlier. And I don't really blame them. And I think if you've got kids, you probably should sell your house and give them some money early, Mary. Anyway, but it is about redistribution. To actually solve the problem, people have got to put their hand up and say, maybe it's not fair that, you know, we're in the housing market when we've got 20% returns. Maybe the government could actually start taxing capital gains and put the refunds or the funds into an affordable housing scheme. One of my favourites is stamp duty. Now, there was a debate between the major political parties about stamp duty, which was pretty characteristic. How are we going for time there? I'm getting a bit warmed up. I'm a bit worried. I could go on forever. Okay, excellent. So, there was a debate about what to do with stamp duty. Thanks very much. And the debate was whether they should pay it over 5 years or whether they shouldn't. Now, that's a silly debate to have about stamp duty. Stamp duty on, you know, that $2 million house now is $100,000. I mean, it's just, funny enough, they never get around to indexing stamp duty. They index everything else, but not stamp duty. The New South Wales government this year, stamp duty estimates in their budget, just from, you know, when they first made it, which is in June last year, till today, they've discovered they've made an additional $744 million in stamp duty. $744 million in 6 months. They're going to collect $6 billion in stamp duty. It's about 25% of their tax revenue. For God's sake, why wouldn't you get some of that, Mary, and put it in an affordable housing fund? Or better still, get rid of stamp duty and start actually taxing people through a land tax or other mechanism. But do the same thing. Take some of that money and put it into affordable housing, but oh my God, they'll never talk about that. And that's the problem we've got. Governments are making money out of booms. We really have got to arc up the level of political debate to get anywhere, you know, further along. If we actually had a gold medal for government regulations that spiked housing prices, on an international scale, Australia would win the gold medal hands down. We've basically done everything possible. We've got negative gearing, which is again just shoveling money into investors' pockets. Sorry? Yeah, absolutely. You know, the capital gains we've cut in half. Any attempt to, you know, take money from speculation in the housing market is basically not on the table. We've had councils, God love them, you know, up until recently, an English friend of mine described councils as groups of homeowners getting together trying to protect their own property values. I think in some councils in Sydney that's a reasonable description. So there's just been, the political fix has been in about let's make housing more affordable because we're in. But what it's done is it's basically driving lots of people out of Sydney. Trying to function now as a global city is almost impossible. Let me finish by giving one example before the hook comes out. I live up the road, you know, we're a university, we're trying to be a global university. The number of times that we've hired the best brains in the world to work on research, particularly on medical research, who've turned up, who've looked at Sydney housing prices, and despite the fact they've accepted the job, have essentially just gone back to the US or, you know, wherever. Trying to run a global city where, you know, not only knowledge workers, but imagine trying to be a bus driver or a nurse or anyone else like that in Sydney. It is just really difficult. And if we don't do something soon, our ability to function effectively a global city will be undermined by our housing prices. Anyway, look, I'm going to finish up there. Please, great to have a bit of a discussion about this. I really would commend this excellent booklet. And, you know, go and talk to your candidates at polling day on Saturday and ask them about what they're going to do about housing, because trust me, at the moment, they're not doing much. So thank you.